Hello all, welcome to BAW Tech Nuggets. Today's topic is saved execution context. So saved execution context is to allow the state of partially completed tasks without losing data. So let's assume you have a human service and it has two coaches and let's say user submits on coach 1 and the token is moving from coach 1 to coach 2. Let's assume if something happens like a network you know failure or server crash, so this may cause losing of data that user enters on coach 1. In that case, we can make use of this saved execution context. This is the main benefit of using the saved execution context. Second point is this saved execution context can be set on the human services that are associated with the user tasks in the BPDs, because user tasks in the BPDs can save the execution context in the database tables and then can be retrieved. But it's not true for the dashboards, standalone services, and URLs. In heritage human services, the saved execution context by default at 3 points. At BPD service, when the token is moving from BPD to service level, and at each coach, and at any point where the SCC checkbox is checked. This is the sample heritage coach. So as you can see, we cannot check or uncheck the saved execution context for the service. On the coach, it is by default checked. So we don't have much control on this HSS flow level. But if you drill down to the service level, you can check or uncheck the CC on the scripts. Also, you can check or uncheck on the gateways too. As I just shown, the SEC setting on the coach it is checked and not changeable. Similarly, for the services, it is unchecked and not changeable. And on the server scripts, it is unchecked, but it is changeable. Unchecked by default, but it is changeable. So as you see, we don't have much control on, for an SEC setting on the root HHS flow level, but you can check or uncheck in the service level. So if something goes wrong in the called service, task will restart from the last SEC checked point. Let me explain this. This is our heritage human service flow. As you can see, the SEC is unchecked by default on the service, unchecked by default on the coach, unchecked, and I checked SEC on the script for the populate data and on the throw exception. So if something goes wrong here on this script, so when you retry the fail steps, since SEC is checked on the populate data, the task will restart from this point because this is the last checked point before the exception. In CSHS, SCC must be specified on the CSHS flow level. The SCC settings inside the called services are simply ignored. In other words, when something goes wrong in the called service, the restart would start from the last SCC checked point on the CSHS level. Let me show you this by example. This is CSHS flow. As you can see, I checked SEC between this service and the coach, and I checked SEC in the called service scripts. Let's assume there is an exception occurs on this script. At this point, the restart would occur from this point because this is the last checked SEC before exception on the CSHS flow. So even though the SEC is checked in the service flow, it will be ignored. The restart token would come out to the CSHS level and then looks for the last SEC checked on the CSHS flow level and then starts from there. Let's see some scenarios for CSHS and HHS. So for scenario 1 on the CSHS, I unchecked SECs on the root level on these three flow lines, and I checked SEC in the called service. So if something goes wrong on the throw exception script, the flow, the restart would occur all the way from the start, because as you can see, the last checked point on the root level is nothing. So it would just start from the start. Let's go to scenario 2. This time I checked the flow line between this service and the coach. So if something goes wrong here, the token come out to the root level and checks the last SSH checked point, which is this one, and then restart would start from here. Now let's go for HHS, Heritage Human Service. So if something goes wrong here, the last checked point, it doesn't come out to the HHS root level. It checks in the service, the called service itself, if there is any SEC checked. So the restart would occur from here. For scenario 2, let's assume I did not check the SECs on the called service. So if something goes wrong here, then it would check. Since SEC is not checked here, it would come out to the root level and then start from the coach. So these are the default sequence flow behaviors on the client side human services. So if you drag a sequence flow between start and coach, the default would be unchecked. Similarly, if we drag a line or sequence flow between coach to coach, by default it is unchecked, the service to coach. But if you drag a sequence flow between coach and postpone, the default SEC is checked and it cannot be unchecked. It makes sense, right? Because when the user hits the postpone, you want to save the SEC. So if you drag a sequence flow between coach to the error end event, the default is checked. And if you drag a line between coach to end, the default is checked. So the IBM recommendation is not to use SEC as liberally as you want. Just use when you feel it is required, because when SEC is checked, all the variables, the positions, the functions will be saved to the execution context, which will add the overhead. Let's see these default sequence flow behaviors in action. So I am dragging a line between start and the coach. So if you see, the default behavior is unchecked. So let me delete that. So next, let's try the flow between the coach to coach. So the default behavior is unchecked. And let's connect the flow between coach and service. So here the default behavior is unchecked. Let me disconnect it and drag and drop the postpone event and connect between coach and the postpone event, and the default behavior is checked and you cannot uncheck it. Now let me drag and drop the error and event and connect between the coach and the error and event. So the default is checked. Similarly, for the end event, the default is checked. Yeah, that's all in today's session. Thank you guys. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.